Hi, everybody. My name is Miles, and I'm with Peak Performers. Thanks so much for jumping back on with me for another installment of Disability Weekly. This week, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. It's just going to be me. I was reflecting on it, and I realized that I've been with Peak Performers now for 9 years, which is nearly a quarter of my life. I actually turned 40 this September. And I was thinking about it, that's a quarter of my life, and I've gained a lot of experiences. But more importantly, I've had a chance to interview a lot of people, many people with a range of different disabilities, chronic health conditions, and disabilities. And each of them have told a different story, but I also can see some common through lines. And I also have my own lived experience to share as well. So today, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be walking you through 9 of some of my key takeaways that I have from being in this field. But I don't want this to be a one-sided conversation of just me talking to the camera. So please take a second to interact and share your own thoughts. Maybe you have a different opinion on some of these opinions than I do, and I want you to share that. So before we get started, please take a second to drop a line and introduce yourself. Hello, Melissa. It's good to see you. Thank you so much for jumping in. And without any further ado, let's jump into the very first kind of topic that I wanted to discuss. Disability is not a bad word. Now, I get into this conversation online an awful darn lot with people. There are many people that prefer different kinds of language choices. Some people prefer, for example, special needs. Some people prefer differently abled. I've even heard things like handy capable. And recently I was engaging with a conversation that was talking about kind of like a newer kind of set of terms that was coming out. People of aspirations, I think was the term that was used, or something kind of like that. Anyway, you'll see many different variations of this, but in my professional opinion, I feel like if we don't use the word disability and instead we beat around the bush, it causes problems with translation, it causes problems with understanding. And it oftentimes culminates a culture of fear that's based around the word itself. So generally, when I'm talking about disability, I will use people with disabilities or person first language, or I will use disabled person. And even within that, people have different individual preferences. So I prefer a person with a disability to refer to myself, whereas I prefer not to use disabled person. But I think that the important thing to take away is that disability is not a bad word. Disability is part of life, it's part of the human experience, and it affects an awful darn lot of us. It's something that is so universal and so very human, and I think it's something that we can talk about a lot more. And for this reason, I would argue that disability is not a bad word. And in fact, it's something that we should be saying more often, even in places where we think that we shouldn't. And the more that we apply euphemisms to describe the experience of disability, the further away that we get from the actual experience itself. And I think that there are different other ways to show pride as opposed to just covering up the experience of disability. But what do you think? Do you use the word disability, or do you prefer other terms to describe the experience of being disabled? I want to say hi to Jim and hi to Kim. Thank you for joining me. It's good to see both of you all here as well. My number 2 thought is that disability must distance itself from fear. When you talk to a lot of advocates, many of them will share their individual, many of them will kind of reach for a very common toolkit. And one of those things that I see that comes up over and over again is that you are temporarily able-bodied. And I kind of hate this. Like, I kind of get where it's coming from, but at the same time, it sounds like a mob threat to me. Like, just you wait, otherwise Jimmy's going to come down and break your kneecaps. It sounds like that. And I think that for me, ultimately, talking about disability and going back to the previous point of disability is not a bad word, I think that it's important that we acknowledge a little bit more that we can talk about disability outside the framework of fear, outside of the framework of something that's bad that is happening, because a lot of times disability is, again, just part of the human experience for many people. Many people don't know any other lived reality. And I think that when we continue to couch it from the standpoint of fear, that's when we get more people that shut down in having conversations about employment, having conversations about including people with disabilities culturally. Ultimately, fear is the thing that stops conversations cold before they ever begin. So, in my opinion, I think that we need to move past the point of fear in talking about disability and instead talk about it as a very real, very human, very normal part of being alive. My number three point is severity is impossible to define. Now, I might get some backlash for this one because if you look in any particular laws that are out there, they almost always define disability in terms of severity or being severely disabled. You know, I the reason that I don't like this is that I don't think that there is a line that we can easily point to. I will admit right out of the gate that there are some people that experience much more barriers related to their disability immediately and often than other people. Particularly if you are a person that has an observable disability, you are probably going to experience the greatest barriers to entry. And I think that the wording behind a lot of this language that are trying to protect people with disabilities, I think that it's trying to support those individuals that experience the greatest barriers out there. However, I don't think it's helpful. I don't think that it's helpful to try to articulate exactly what severe is, because so oftentimes it's contextual and depends on the individual situation. I'll give you an example. Most of the time, me being a profoundly hearing impaired individual, sorry, hard of hearing, it depends on the person you're talking to and what language they prefer to use. But being a hard of hearing person myself, I'm fine most of the time, but when you take me out to a crowded bar where I don't wear my hearing aids that particular day, suddenly, my hearing becomes very severely disabling and I can't really interact or communicate with the people. And I think that if you look at any significant disability experience, it's going to come down to situational kind of thing. Now, there are many people out there that experience disabilities much more frequently and they pose as a barrier constantly in their life. But I don't think that the severity label is helpful for anybody. And we're seeing this right now play out within autism, because right now there is conversations about splitting the autism spectrum between severe autism versus like those, I guess, that have run-of-the-mill autism. I'm not really sure. But again, I would wonder where that line is. And I think the final point that I would make right here is that a lot of times we just can't know how it's affecting someone. So for example, I work with many people with depression disorder on a regular basis, and oftentimes it appears like they're fine and it appears like it's not severe. However, if you've ever known somebody that has taken their own life before, at what point do we start calling that severe? To me, it seems like it's something that we should be addressing and talking about and thinking about more from a lens of supporting all individuals as opposed to qualifying how severe somebody's disability affects them. We're going to take a quick pause right here to check the comments. Melissa says that she prefers person first language, as does Kim. Thank you both for chiming in. It's good to hear from both of you and appreciate you chiming into the conversation as well. My fourth one that I like to talk about is disability as an identity, and particularly disability has many identities. And I'm going to challenge you right now. If you were to go out and you were to look and do a Google search for person with a disability on Google Images, I guarantee that 90% of the individuals that are going to pop up are going to be individuals that are in a wheelchair. However, 90% of people that have a disability, it's estimated that they have a non-observable condition. So when we think about disability, we need to actually acknowledge the full scope and the full range of experiences that people have. And a part of that is acknowledging the range of identities that people have as well. Now, identity oftentimes comes down to the specific individual disability or neurodiversity that they experience. However, I would typically break it apart into three individual buckets, as you were. So for example, we have people with disabilities, and typically this is something that is observable about a person or easily measurable, quantifiable, and is oftentimes the first thing that you think of in regards to thinking about disability. So for example, if I show up at an audiologist's office, they can measure my hearing and they can look at the slope as it goes downhill, and they can very clearly and easily see that kind of scope as it drops down. You might be able to see somebody that walks in, for example, using a prosthetic leg because they have a different gait to them, or they roll in a wheelchair. Or you might even observe somebody, for example, that speaks with a stutter, and that's observable. And again, these folks are oftentimes the one that face the greatest barriers to being able to participate in stuff. However, there are two other very different camps that are out there. The second of which that I would point out is those individuals that are neurodiverse. Now, neurodiversity is a very interesting term, and it's one that is changing very quickly. It is fairly new, and when it first came out, it was originally used to describe the experience of autism, but that's changing, right? Language changes, and that's part of the things that we need to keep up with. I myself might find myself using different words, different phrases, coming out down the line. But neurodiversity is one of those really interesting ones because it has transitioned now to really describing any kind of cognitive difference. And I would also describe that people with neurodiversities, they're the most proud among us. Like, they're oftentimes the ones that are championing it and saying that my disability is my superpower. And I think that that's a pretty incredible perspective to have. And that's a pretty cool outlook on having what the Americans with Disabilities Act would call a disability. Now, the third quiet kind of group that's also equally massive is those individuals with chronic health conditions. So these are the folks that have long COVID. These are the cancer survivors that are out there. These are the person that live with Crohn's disease. Oftentimes, they're the ones that are most embarrassed by their condition. Pride is a very distant kind of concept for them in thinking about disability, but I think that that's changing. I think that more and more people are finding community with other people who also have chronic health conditions like them. They're finding community and they're finding support by finding other people. And I think this is one of the miracles of social media, is being able to let people realize that they're not alone. So when I think about identities, again, I'm breaking it into three different groups: disability, or anything that is observable about a person. We have neurodiversities, or any kind of cognitive difference, including ADHD, autism. We're talking about folks with mental health disorders. We're also talking about people with traumatic brain injuries, any kind of cognitive difference that is affecting the way that somebody communicates, thinks, and participates within this world. And then finally, we have those with chronic health conditions, which is a whole wide range of different conditions that people experience. And I think what's interesting to me is that we're probably going to see this change within the next couple of years. And we may even see more and more categories emerge as people, as they start to find identity and they start to find community. The fifth thing that I want to talk about is the ADA is flawed, and it's also the best we have. So I oftentimes joke with employers that if your disability inclusion strategy is to follow the ADA, you don't have a disability inclusion strategy. And I mean that to rib them a little bit, but I think that that's, in all seriousness, like, that really kind of underpins the failings of the ADA, because the ADA might guarantee, freedom from discrimination. But I think at the same time, it really doesn't do anything culturally. Like, it doesn't do anything to change the experiences of people with disabilities within our workplace. What are they experiencing? Like, do they feel included? Because inclusion goes beyond just being able to walk in through the front door. It also includes, being able to be promoted within the role that you have, being invited to after work activities, being able to access everything into the office without any kind of assistance. Like, inclusion goes so much wider than simply being able to get in through the front door. And I think that that's an important thing to call out. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, foundational piece of legislation, now 36 years old, but it's also still relatively new. And I think that if there's something that gives me hope, is I am excited to see the way that this changes and evolves. And in fact, like, it's already been amended in the early 2000s under George W. Bush in order to include non-observable disabilities as well. So I think that we need to continue pushing the envelope as well about what do we want to see in legislation that protects and supports us as well. I'm going to take a quick break to comment. Melissa, I appreciate you chiming in here with your own thoughts. A person's disability may be more physical or obvious, but doesn't mean their mind isn't brilliant and sharp. Amen to that. Absolutely. The sixth thing that I want to talk about is that the unemployment status quo is unacceptable. So, if you've heard me speak before, then you've heard me kind of frequently reference that the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is about double that of the national average. And this trend has held steady pretty much as long as we've been measuring the unemployment rate and calculating people with disabilities among those individuals. However, I think that it also tells a slightly different story too, because realistically, I think that the unemployment rate is functionally much higher. What I look at, being a person that looks at labor force trends and workforce participation, is I look at the workforce participation rate. Now, this tells a very different story than the unemployment rate, because what we've seen is that we've seen it gone in the 1990s from around 67, 68% total labor force participation rate among those between the ages of I believe it's like 18 to 65 or so. And it's now kind of cratered and gone to around 60 to 61%. Now, that may not sound like a huge difference, but we're talking about millions of people that are no longer participating within the workforce. Now, to be fair, some of that are people that are aging out of the workforce and choosing to retire. Some of those individuals might be people that are caregiving for an elderly family member or a young child as well. There might be people that just don't participate for various different other reasons, but a lot of those people are individuals with disabilities that have become so upset and so discouraged with the job search process and employment prospects that they've chosen to give up altogether. And I think that that's worth acknowledging. We just accept that the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is double that of the national average and always has been. And that makes me really mad. That makes me genuinely upset that we haven't moved the needle significantly, with one exception. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw the unemployment rate for people with disabilities slightly tick down to include more people, but that's changed. That's gone right back to where it was. And I think that the biggest call to action for any employers that might be thinking about this and listening to this is realize first and foremost that disability hiring is good for business. You can and should hire more people with disabilities because it is a large pool of untapped labor that is out there. But secondly, we all can do better. If we are in a position to hire more people, we need to be thinking about what are the reasons that people with disabilities are not participating, and what are the people with disabilities that are not applying, or what is the reason that we're not selecting individuals with disabilities to be able to participate within our workforce. It's a heavy question, but I think it's one that we all need to think on a little bit more. Speaking of which, I might get some blowback for this, but I'm okay with that. Employers need to do better with accommodations. I've spoken with a lot of people about their individual experience with accommodations, and I would also kind of point you towards the interview that I did with Karen Boxer, where she talks about adding more structure to the accommodation process. That's still an interview that I go back to on a regular basis that has profoundly influenced the way that I think about this. But at the end of the day, here's kind of how I think about it, is that if you put process over people, your process sucks. If you put process over people, your process already sucks. It's already flawed from the get-go. Many times when people request an accommodation, first off, just numbers for you. 75% of all people who have requested an accommodation at some point in their career have been flat out denied such an accommodation before. However, at the same time, it's statistically much more likely that somebody's just going to quit their job and move around than it is that they're going to actually ask for an accommodation in the first place. And I think that a lot of this comes down to the onus. So when we think about it, we're supposed to be engaging in an interactive process, a brainstorming process, where we identify that there's a problem, but we also identify that the employer hired us to do something. And now is on the employer's part, not necessarily to figure everything out, but to engage in that interactive process and to work with the individual to try to find something that works. Here's where it fails, is that oftentimes what happens is that you are a person, you have to first off voice up and you have to self identify saying, hey, I have a disability. Then you have to read your employer's mind to try to figure out what it is that they might actually approve. Then you have to bring it up. You have to document the heck out of everything. Then you must follow up with it over and over and over again and badger them to grant you that accommodation request. And then if that accommodation request doesn't actually work out, then it's on you to figure out how to follow up with them and find something else that works. At the same time, you're trying to do your job that you were hired to do. You're trying to protect your livelihood. And you also are probably managing things like, maybe people are treating you differently or thinking about you differently, or maybe you're even being put on a performance improvement plan at work because you're seen as a little bit you're not seen as reliable or that you have a good work product. Like there's all kinds of problems with this and stuff. So my biggest call to the employers out there is that recognize that if you think that the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is too high, I think that you also need to recognize that you need to do more throughout the entire accommodations process to be able to engage and interact with people and help them brainstorm so that they can find ways that they can work within your workforce. Because at the end of the day, over half of all accommodations do not cost a penny. And a lot of times it's just a matter of thinking creatively and flexibly about different solutions. My number 8 thing that I want to talk about is that inclusion means everyone. So, a lot of times when I talk with people in general about disability, what they say to me is they say, "Oh, well, good for you, Miles. I'm so glad that you're doing this work." And the implication there is that I'm glad that you're doing this work, Miles, so that I don't have to. But if we recognize that the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is too high, and we recognize that they're not being treated fairly throughout this entire experience, we also have to recognize that that it is necessary for all of us to do our part. And I think that everybody has a disability story to tell. Maybe not you yourself directly, but I guarantee that you know somebody in your life that has a disability, neurodiversity, or chronic health condition. It's inevitable, right? Like 26% of Americans have something, and I guarantee that you know somebody or multiple somebodies, or you yourself have one. So it's time to step up. It's time to talk about it. It's time to remove the fear that may be attached to thinking about these things, because I think only by talking about it that we can really kind of remove that fear. And at the same time, this also means that when you have coworkers around you that have disabilities and you've recognized that, it's time to stop walking around on eggshells around them and pretending like they don't exist, or avoiding eye contact, right? Like inclusion is on you to try to figure out how to support them and include them within the workplace. Inclusion means everyone. The final lesson that I would share with you is that when it comes to disability, the future is bright. There's a couple different ways to look at this. We recently celebrated 250 years of history as a nation. And I think that that's an incredible milestone for many of us. I think equally important is that we've experienced 36 years of protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which may be flawed, but is the best that we have and the best that's available right now. When thinking about the ADA, 36 years in the history of our country is still relatively young. There's not a whole lot of history there. And I think that that's what makes me so hopeful. I also look at some of the different trends that are happening around identity as well, because whereas disability might be thought of something previously as something to be fearful of, or something that you would give to in the matter of charity, I think that that is changing. And I think that a lot of people are recognizing that disability is part of that natural experience. And I think that there's a lot more people that are willing to stand up and willing to say that the current status quo is unacceptable and that we want to change it. And I would particularly applaud Gen Z for this. There are more people than ever within Gen Z that identify as being neurodiverse. There are more of them than ever that openly identify as being disabled and consider that part of their core identity as well. And they're willing to talk about it. They're willing to share it with you, not in a way that, is strange or like, too much information, but rather just as part of their sheer lived experience. And that's exciting to me. I love seeing that this generation that's coming around behind me is so open and willing to talk about it and is eager to look for change because they, as a generation, is not willing to accept, oh, well, we just don't talk about that kind of thing. And that's the don't tell, don't ask, don't tell kind of thing at work. They're looking at it differently. They look at inclusion, they look at participation as fundamental and foundational parts to the places that they want to work at, and they won't accept anything else. And I think that that's something to be really hopeful for because disability is part of the human experience. Accommodations are just adaptations or technology that allow all of us to better participate within the workforce as well as within the broader society. And I think that as more and more of us age, we're going to realize that disability is not something that we have to be afraid of, but something that we can be grateful for because it just means that we have a name for something, that we have a community of people that share this experience, and that we have tools around us to be able to allow us to continue to participate within the society and even within the workplace as well. I would say at this point, thank you for coming to my TED Talk, but I think 25 minutes is a little bit long for a TED Talk. I want to thank Melissa and Kim for jumping into the chat and sharing their own experiences as well. Please join me next week. Next week, we're going to be talking a little bit more at noon, actually. So we're going to be shifting it a little bit later. But I'm going to be having Dr. Ang Young coming to talk about the compromise that's often reached, right? Like the world that we have versus the one that we want to have, and how to push for accessibility across a much wider spectrum in that whole thing, while recognizing the current lived experience that we have right now versus the future workplace we want to build. So make sure to join us. Again, that's going to be next Friday at noon this time, not at 11:30. So please join us again. And thanks to everybody that watched this. It's good to see you. Until next time, this has been Miles from Peak Performers. See you later.